Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Ransomware, Security Solutions for Your Firm. Today's presenters, you have Phil and Matt this afternoon, and they're going to walk through this slide deck for the next hour with you. Just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to both of them. You can customize what you're seeing right now by going to the GoToWebinar screen viewer. You can maximize the presentation or the videos to feel like you're in the same room as them, whatever you prefer. We do have a few different audio options here. We have computer audio and phone call. We do find that the phone is a little bit more reliable as it is not streamed over internet. We will be taking questions if we have some time at the end, so please feel free to drop those questions in the questions panel as we do not monitor the chat box during the presentation. We will have 3 polling questions throughout the presentation today. Make sure that you answer those. If you're looking for that CPE credit, you must answer all 3 in order to obtain that. We do have the handout that we will be going through this afternoon available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. And for that CPE, make sure that you are filling out that survey and indicating that you do need that. And we do use a third party called SimpleCert to distribute those certificates. So please allow 1 to 2 business days for those to drop into your inbox. And if you don't see that, please check your junk and spam. And if you don't find it in there, please feel free to send us an email. Speaking of the survey, let us know how we did. And if we don't get into your questions this afternoon, there is a space to add comments and questions in that survey as well. So without further ado, gentlemen, they're all yours.
All right, thanks, Kaylee, appreciate it. So just a little bit of context on ourselves. So the presenters here, myself and Matt, my role is Managing Director of our technology practice at Stanball Ness. Our team helps clients across the globe, whether it be from your day-to-day operational IT issues, resolving those through managing cybersecurity risk for the organization. That's what we're here to talk about today. With me is Matt. Matt joins us. He came to Stanball Ness coming from Deloitte. So very, very familiar with incident response, breach response, and just overall how we reduce the business's risk as it relates to cybersecurity. And I think one of the biggest questions that continues to come about as we're out in the industry and interacting with customers, as it puts right here, you know, when we think about ransomware, what is it? How does it infiltrate? How do we secure ourselves? And ultimately, I think that one of the biggest questions really comes down to, oh crap, if we are breached, do we pay the ransom or do we try to recover if we have the right tools in place? So Matt and I are going to walk through today some scenarios here for you guys. And I always like to have the webinars that I do more interactive, more of a moderator style, I guess, if you will. So Matt and I will be conversing, and I'll be asking him some questions here, some very pointed questions as it relates to ransomware, zero trust, and how organizations should secure their infrastructure. And feel free, by all means, I have the question box up here. Allow this to be interactive for yourself. You know, engage if you feel the need to. Matt and I will try to answer the questions on the fly as they come about. Certainly don't want to sidetrack too much from the presentation here because that's what's going to keep us on track, because Matt and I do like to talk. So we had the presentation here to make sure that we stick within our hour time frame. But if you do have questions, feel free to throw them out there to us. So as always with any PowerPoint or any presentation, you have statistics, okay? And I think we can all attest that year over year, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and now looking into 2023, the risk factor for organizations from a potential breach perspective continues to be rampant, continues to be amplified year over year as we become a more connected society. And I always like to go back and I think it maybe dark days for some, maybe brighter days for others as they had to rethink, but we always call it the COVID era, right? And we think about what COVID has made a lot of organizations wrap their arms around, especially from an IT perspective. Man, IT teams, if you weren't at a good place pre-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID, you may have really been struggling to try to understand how you manage the risk for users working from home, accessing data, I mean, of course, even down to the disruption in the supply chain. I can't get laptops. I can't get, whatever it may be, you name it. The supply chain was disrupted. So now IT teams are trying to figure out, okay, if I can't get hardware in a timely fashion, how do I get those end users to work remotely if they can't come to the office? So now they're having to use possibly personal machines to remote into corporate infrastructure. So we'll walk through some of those scenarios again here today, but ransomware as a service here as the States is now a commonplace, and of course actors are definitely doubling down, and they are holding that data as ransom, demanding payment. And again, as one of the questions that we'll walk through later on here in the presentation, do you pay it or don't you pay it? Then, of course, this percentage of cybersecurity professionals who do not believe their organization is prepared for a ransom attack, 50%. And I'll tell you, folks, Matt and I and a few of our other individuals on our cybersecurity team, we've been interacting and working through what we call security risk assessments or audits for many organizations. And I'll tell you, it's amplified over the course probably the past 2 years. And what we've seen is IT professionals, so internal IT CIOs, IT directors, IT managers, systems admins, they all understand that, hey, they know where they need to go because they see the risks that are imposed on their infrastructure, what they're trying to tidy up day in and day out. But sometimes the crux is getting that information relayed to management committee, leadership, CFO, CEO, whoever it may be that's in the role of making the decisions as to whether or not they should move forward or not. A lot of times that those proposals or those objectives tend to get stalled. And I don't know if it's because maybe internal IT is struggling to have leadership understand the ramifications that if you don't do X, Y, or Z, it could cause the cascading effect. But what we've seen is a lot of organizations bring us in as a uninterested third party, I guess we'll call it, to validate in some instances what internal IT has been stating for quite some time, and that is validate or finding the gaps and understanding how to remediate those gaps. And or ultimately, the goal here, the end goal is to reduce risk for the owners, shareholders, stakeholders, business leaders, etc. And then, of course, one of the last things here, and again, none of these 4 items here are surprising to myself, and I don't know that they should be surprising to many people, but over the last 2 years, ransomware attacks have certainly increased a lot, almost doubling. You think about 97%. And following industry experts and being part of a lot of IT roundtables, there's opportune times for cybersecurity professionals to be able to come into organizations and help secure and help close those gaps. Now, Matt, I'll lean into you a little bit here. This here's, I think, one of the slides or the drawings that you had come up with here and felt is valid maybe to put into this presentation here. But walk us through, when you think about ransomware, an illustration of the beginning to the end.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Phil. So generally, ransomware attacks are going to follow this 7-step process as I outlined. Generally, there's 3 primary methods of entry for malware and ransomware in particular. They're generally going to exploit a user either by a phishing email, perhaps compromised through some form of remote access, whether that's remote desktop for Windows users. Another big vector of attack is also single-factor authentication to VPN access. Once those credentials are compromised, the attacker gets in here, as I tried to illustrate. One of the first things they will do, and most Microsoft enterprises will have an Active Directory database, and for those of you who aren't familiar, is essentially a database of users and perhaps administrators and perhaps service accounts, which can act on behalf of users and or administrators to access services. Once an attacker gains access to that Active Directory database, they have full domain access, and can effectively gain credentials for a multitude of users throughout the organization, which in part helps them to move laterally to other systems. Once that's done, and if you look here, one of the key things I try to point out is they will go after your backups. So one of the things I recommend to everyone is to have, we'll get to this a little bit more in depth later, but is to have multiple copies of your backups, some stored off-site, so as to minimize the damage from this type of potential attack. They will come after your backups and deploy their ransomware there, such that your backups are now encrypted and or unusable. And if you see here, they will pivot. Malware likes nothing more than to propagate, which ultimately leads to havoc and chaos as well as stress. And take it from someone that's been part of several major notable and publicized breaches, that is a stressful environment. And then, of course, you see the last step whereby money is demanded. And Phil alluded to this a little bit earlier on. There's two forms of extortion here. There's one, the literal encryption of data, and so that data becomes unusable, number one. Number two, if there is any sensitive data that has been pilfered or exfiltrated, there's no guarantee that even if you pay the ransom, the ransomware operators won't release that at a later date or try to extort you further.
And Matt, when we think about, you had mentioned, some of the stuff there, and again, these are, it could be for a completely different webinar, but you think about flat networks and VLANing and multi-factor authentication. Those are all items that IT teams should be evaluating as they continue to shore up and secure their infrastructure. But when we think about the assessments, the audits that Stamble Nets that we complete for clients, we have clients that come to us, and one of the big, if you think about NIST, right? NIST 853 or NIST 800-171, which then some of you may have heard about CMMC or Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, okay? These are some buzzwords that are out there in the industry and some frameworks. So Matt, maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the leading frameworks that companies should be at least standardizing against. It's not saying, hey, we're working on government contracts or doing stuff with the DoD, and now they're saying, hey, we need to be CMMC compliant. That's not necessarily what I'm leaning to. What are leading frameworks? What are some of the leading frameworks that you as an organization, regardless of whether or not you have a compliance factor in this that you must comply with, but you should at least, the very least, be complying with framework X, Y, or Z? What may they be, Matt?
Sure, Phil. I think immediately three come to mind. You mentioned NIST. The NIST cybersecurity framework is considered by many to be the gold standard. And I want to differentiate when I talk about frameworks in a little bit more detail. There are programmatic frameworks, of which the cybersecurity framework is, and then there are control frameworks, of which two of which you mentioned, 800-53 and 800-171. There is also ISO, which many of you may be familiar with. That is an internationally recognized standard. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth in a minute about the critical security controls, and probably one of my favorite frameworks to lean on. Digging a little bit into the cybersecurity framework, as I mentioned, that's more programmatic in nature. And for those of you who don't know, at a high level, they identify 5 columns, which equate to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And as Phil had alluded to, there's also 800-53, which primarily is concerned with government. There is also 800-171, which Phil also had mentioned, and deals with CMMC. And this is specific to entities that are within the defense industrial base and who deal with or process at some level controlled unclassified information. There's also, as I mentioned, the ISO framework and methodology, which is also programmatic in nature and less control focused. They operate on a methodology that goes by plan, do, check, act. And so in the planning phases, that's where you establish policies and procedures. The do component is where you actually implement the policy and effectuate it. The check component monitors your policy and evaluates how it's doing, and whereas the act component updates and improves upon the policy that you've established. The last one I'll mention is the critical security controls. As I mentioned, it's one of my favorites. It's kind of my go-to and our go-to. And the reason I say that is because, to me, it's by far and away the most actionable and real-world example of simply what to do. What do I do? What do I need to do? What controls do I need? What exactly do I need to implement where? And what's most critical? They're extremely easy to use. For those who don't know, there are 18 domains, and within that, there are 153 controls. And those 153 controls are also broken down into implementation groups. And this becomes important and useful because as you pivot from implementation group 1 up to implementation group 3, that generally indicates a more robust level of control implementation, if you will. So some organizations may not be ready or have the resources to implement a control at a level 3. However, implementing at least implementation group 1 will give you a very general and foundational piece of security hygiene.
That's good. And Matt, you had made a comment there, and something I'll lean into here in a little bit, but with some of those frameworks, it's, having actionable items to come out of that and creating roadmaps, right? And understanding, and the simplest thing, a question that I was posed not that long ago was, hey, in the event that you have a breach, and I'm thinking about whether it be, I'm thinking maybe C-level, okay, CEO, CFO of an organization, controller, what have you. In the event that there's a breach within the organization, who's the first person you call? Is it your IT person? Is it your lawyer? Is it your cyber liability carrier? Who are you reaching out to first? And a lot of folks that I've made that pointed question to, it's like, well, we think we know that we just reach out to our IT team and let them handle it. But do they know who to call? Do they know how to respond to it? And those are things that fall in alignment with what we call an IR, or incident response plan. And those are all things that are key as you walk through creating a shored up cybersecurity plan. And again, just stuff for organizations to continue to consider that, hey, and the old adage there, or the old question of, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to be breached. I mean, I think we've all heard that over and over, but organizations really need to take that to heart and truly have in their plan, if there is a breach, what's the first thing that they do, right?
Sure.
Now, next up, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's a good question. Just to answer to get my 2 cents, I might parse that question in the following manner. I think that question can be answered. There's who you should call, and then who you must call. And so if I dig into that a little bit, certainly a technical expert, whether that's incident response, whether you guys are, your organization is managed by an MSP, they should have resources on hand to be able to assist you from a technical perspective. As Phil had alluded to, there may also be some legal ramifications to a breach. Almost any breach, actually, is going to be subject to some sort of legal component. And so whether that's in-house counsel and or an outside attorney that's perhaps retained. And then if I pivot to who you must call, or who I believe you must call, certain states are going to have jurisdictions that are going to fall into and under, and they will have reporting guidelines should you fall within a particular state's regulation. An additional component I might law enforcement, be a local police department, or even perhaps the FBI. Phil also mentioned insurance carriers. They're going to be a primary method of communication. Phil also mentioned, and for those who may not be aware, may not have an incident response plan in place, your cyber insurance carrier is going for incident response. Ideally, you will have one of itself for your own. If you are managed by an MSP, they will have one. All else fails, your cyber insurance carrier is your incident response. They will have the Army to put folks in place to attack the problem. The last thing I'll mention is that if you are a part of critical, this actually put out to be notified within 72 hours of this breach.
And Matt, we have a question that came in here, and I'll jump into that. Before we get to that, we have a polling question here, and I'll launch that now. But what level of confidence do you have in your organization's employment of security fundamentals? And when I say security fundamentals, think about multi-factor authentication across domain accounts, VPN connections. So when you connect to the network, are you entering just your username and password, or are you actually using an additional form, whether it be connected through a text message, sending a little link or a code? Same thing with thinking about your disaster recovery plan. What's your backup, what we call your BCDR, your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. So don't just think about, well, hey, I think we're secure. We've got a good IT team behind us, and we think they're doing things as they should, but maybe dig a little bit deeper and be honest with yourselves. That's why I always tell people to be honest with yourself when you truly think about cybersecurity. And I had to do that right at Stanville Nest. We really had to think about how we're ingesting client data. It's not just, and that's what frustrates me the most, I guess, if you will, it's not just our data. So it's not just Stanville Nest's infrastructure, Stanville Nest's data that we're having to contend with. It's all the other data that we're ingesting, customer data. And we need to treat that data like it's our own, like it's gold, like if we lost that data, we would be down just as well. We can't just think about our own infrastructure. So put that in mind there as well. So I'm going to launch this poll and go ahead and take a few minutes and answer it. And Matt, while we're doing that, we have a question that came through. Somebody asked a question. We had a couple of incidents where subcontractors were breached, and they sent us, again, possibly an infected email attachment. Like we hear quite frequently, emails compromised. Somebody sends out emails from a compromised email account. Well, it goes out to customer base. Any good thoughts on contracting with subcontractors have good cybersecurity practices in place? I could certainly add my 2 cents into this, but Matt, I'll give you some time here to throw in some scenarios there, maybe your 2 cents, if you will. What should you be looking at as you vet out those subcontractors or third parties that you're working with?
Sure. So I just touched on a number of frameworks. One thing I would, to see if those third parties are leveraging any sort of security controls and or frameworks within their own purview. A lot of folks on this, whether you're a contract on a contract, are used to security airs, if you will, cover the basics, set of security hygiene follows. I certainly insist upon something we'll touch on a bit too. Is zero trust access, which help considerably access by third parties.
Hey Matt, you're cutting in and out there a little bit. Maybe just can't bag audio or video for a second. See if that helps out with the bandwidth.
Sure.
And while Matt's getting resituated there, when we think about the first polling question here that went out, what level of confidence do you have in your organization's deployment of security fundamentals? 75% confident, 100% confident. Let me go through this here. It was 15% of the folks were confident. 33% were 50% confident. 49% of the folks were 75% confident, and 4% of the folks that had answered were 100% confident. So, hey, as always, right? Whenever I go through these webinars and I get the upper echelon, it's like, man, like I feel we've got it going on. We're pretty comfortable. What I like to do is have a chat with those organizations because I want to understand what they're doing to have a high level of confidence. And, some of the key questions I'll pose, when's the last time you've had a vulnerability test or a penetration test or an overall security posture audit? When was the last time that you've had not a breach, but a potential breach? And those potential breaches you should be able to measure those through certain systems through your cybersecurity stack. But those are questions that I would certainly like to have, or conversations that I would like to have with that top 4% that's 100% confident in their security posture, which is, that's fantastic. Matt, back on the question, I don't know if you're back in there, but some recommendations there for vetting out those third-party contractors, those subcontractors, to make sure that they have a good cybersecurity posture practice in place.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. What I was alluding to earlier was just the fact that there are third-party security questionnaires, which I believe many organizations have received on their side, if and when they're a subcontractor. And so use those and pass them back to third parties. Ensure that they're undertaking minimum security level of hygiene. One thing I would also suggest, I mentioned this too, ask if they're using any for their security. Make sure that you have full of confidence in the controls that they're affecting and their overall practices. One of the things I also mentioned, I know we'll touch on this shortly, is the potential leveraging of something such that third will only have access specifically permitted to and nothing.
And when we think about, and I think Matt, you have a little bit of a breakup there yet, but back to that question there that was asked too, and it's something for Stanball-Ness, and I always like to go back to, hey, you practice what you preach, right? The methodologies, the mindset, if you will, that we deploy across our customers and how we gauge customer risk is we deploy the same practices at Stanball-Ness. And the question that was posed, how do you vet out third parties? There, to Matt's point, there's questionnaires out there, and there's questionnaires that we put out to customers. There's quite a few questionnaires that we've received as well, especially from data services side of it, because if we're ingesting client data, that organization has every right to know who's accessing it, where's it being stored, how's it being backed up, and any other questions that they may have in there. It's what we call a vendor risk assessment form. So those are things that you should certainly 100%. Is multi-factor authentication in place? These are all questions, very good questions, that you should be asking your third party whenever you're sharing information. And that is a huge factor when you're dealing with anything on the government side, DoD perspective. Those are questions that definitely will come out, and just in terms of even the handling of the CUI. And for this slide here, when we think about as ransomware evolves, what's the same in 2022? I always tell people that from a technology perspective, there's IT folks like to complicate things, but there's always a foundation, right? You always have where the internet comes in and what we call your DMARC, and from that DMARC out is where it branches into the corporation to business, okay? That's where, I wouldn't say that's where you start, because you should also be evaluating the ISP, but that's really where IT teams and businesses really need to evaluate, okay, we've got firewalls, we've got switching, how are we layering stuff, do we have VLANs, and then branching it out from there. But when we think about the modern systems here, the modern variants, I guess, if you will, email phishing, software vulnerabilities, and then, of course, RDP, remote access, compromise through VPN. These are the top 3 vulnerabilities for ransomware, vectors for attack, and they always will be, unless, who knows, there may be something new that comes out tomorrow or next year. But Matt, if you're on there, if you have your audio back, maybe dig a little bit deeper into from an email phishing, software vulnerability, and the RDP, the remote access, or it could be VPN side of it. Provide some context there, or what your thoughts are on how organizations should shore up their cybersecurity in relation to these three variants for attack. All right, not sure if Matt's on yet or not, but the way that I look at this, right, when I think about these top three, I always look at IT teams, number one, right? And I think about the email phishing as well, and the VPN side of it. Software vulnerabilities. Matt and I go through this very frequently with organizations, especially larger organizations that have software development that's happening. The big question comes into play, okay, if you are doing software development, do you have a test environment? Who's vetting the stuff out before it goes to market? Even down to, when you think about software vulnerabilities, you have your internal IT team, and you have all these systems that are out there. So you've got workstations, laptops, desktops, servers, whether they be physical hosts or virtual machines. How are they being managed, patched, right? How are third-party apps being patched and managed? How are Windows updates being pushed and managed? I mean, my goodness, we just had a conversation with it's about 900 to 1,000 employee firm. And that was the question that came up, because they looked at us and they said, hey, Stanwell Ness, can you come in and help us remediate, triage and remediate under what we call like a SOC SIM, your Security Operations Center, to be able to look at all these alerts that are coming through, triage them, label them on a risk from 1, 2, or 3, 1 being the lowest, 3 being the highest. And I said, well, before we get to that piece, I said, let's take a look at the infrastructure side of it. What's your patch schedule look like? How are you vetting third-party patches, updates? And it's like, well, we just do Patch Tuesday. Whatever comes out, and this is a large firm, keep in mind, for in my mind. So like, yeah, well, we have most of the local users, admins on their machines, and they run the updates themselves. And it's like, that screams risk at the highest level. But this is what folks are doing. And I don't know, it's not because they're uneducated. It's because the IT team, they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to leverage resources to sit there and manage and triage and go through this stuff and legitimately validate whether or not it's a risk that needs to be addressed immediately, or if it's a risk that can be addressed in a day or two. And when I say a risk, right, a lot of people may look at me and say, well, every risk needs to be validated and assessed immediately. True, it's a matter of remediation. Is it something that, a Java or Adobe update may be missing, a version may be missing the latest update, can it go a couple days, etc. But these are things that when we think about software vulnerabilities, huge red flag when I talk to organizations, and they just go through you can think about WSUS as well, pushing out through servers, but it's still a manual process in most scenarios. There's a lot of automation out there through what we call RMM tools and scripting that can happen to automate the processes and to help IT teams really leverage automation to cut down on the amount of what I call noise. And then we think about email phishing. Again, if we didn't have people clicking stuff they shouldn't, sitting in front of a computer, hey, here's a good example. Today, I received a GoDaddy notification, hey, your credit card's expired. And man, it took me a while. I probably spent 15 minutes chewing over that email and researching stuff on the internet. Is this legitimate? Or is it something that because my credit card had expired. So was it something that just caught me right in that moment? And it was legit, it was valid. But man, like, my mind immediately goes to anytime I'm asked to enter credentials or update credit card information or anything having to do with finance, man, I pause and I run myself through certain questions, and I even go out to the internet and search, hey, and I look at the domain. There's other things that I look at in there as well, just to validate. So email phishing, man, the only thing that people ask all the time, hey, what can be done? How can we help limit the amount of spam and spam emails that come through? And it's like, well, there's certain protocol that you can put in place on the backside if whether you're in a Microsoft platform or G Suite platform or Google platform. But really what it comes down to, end user training. And there's software out there. We used Know before. There's plenty of other softwares out there that do the email phishing for you, but it's education, education, education. And my goodness, as much email, as many emails as we get today, and it only becomes more and more each day, you really got to treat those or educate those end users to be very cautious of what emails to pop open. And it's not just popping open, but it's entering information. Hey, Matt, are you on yet? Or are you still bouncing around out there?
Can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha. Hey, good thing I know what I'm talking about there a little bit, right? But you think about here that before we get into this one here, Matt, the age-old question, okay? We think about the slide before this here, the modern ransomware variants that are breaching victim systems in one of three ways, these three being. When we think about organizations that have been breached, do you pay the ransom? Or do you say it, and in my words, you go pound sand, right? Forget it. I'm not paying the ransom. What do you do? How do you combat that? Comments?
Yeah, sure. Struggling with some audio, so bear with. I would say the following, this question's not as straightforward as it may appear. And I say that because this question can be answered by security and technical personnel. So organizations need to consider the following. There was actually a survey that showed that only approximately 65% of that data was recovered after payment, and only 8% of organizations managed to recover all of their data. So just because you're paying does not guarantee your data will be recovered. And part of that reason is because the encrypted files are often unrecoverable. And while attackers may provide decryptors and things like that upon payment, they oftentimes crash or fail or are unable to do the job of decrypting the information and or data. Also, something to consider is that full recovery of an organization's data can be a slow process. So if you have large amounts of data, we're talking gigabytes or greater, that can take weeks to decrypt, supposing the decryptors actually work. Also keep in mind, you may need to procure a digital wallet and convert US dollars into cryptocurrency, which can also be somewhat tedious and take time. One of the key things I'll also stress, and I think is a big point to make, is that if you're solely paying the ransom without doing any further investigation or root cause analysis, keep in mind that those malicious files may still be resident within your network. And so if you're solely paying, you need to put controls in place and get to the root cause of the initial issue. And if not, there's a high likelihood of subsequent attack, perhaps by the same threat actor, perhaps by a different one. The last thing I'll mention, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that if you had sensitive data taken or pilfered, you have no guarantee that an adversary will delete the stolen data after they receive payment. My final thought is just as follows. You need to be careful because just because you pay doesn't absolve you from what the U.S. Treasury Department put out in one of their advisories, which can impose civil fines and hefty fines at that for companies that violate sanctions and go against a sanctioned entity and pay money or ransom to them in a sanctioned country. And that, if you'd like to research this further, it's called the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. They released a advisory in 2020 that states exactly this.
And Matt, if you guys look at the screen here, it says, oldies but goodies remain. The supply chain compromise. There's two in here that, and it's nobody's immune to it. And I want to make that very clear. Sam Wellness could get hit tomorrow. You could get hit tomorrow. It's a matter of how do you recover, okay? And what gets me here is you think about SolarWinds and Kaseya, and you've got Ninja, RMM out there. These are what we call RMM, remote management monitoring tools. These are tool sets that someone like Stanball Nest uses to manage from a IT perspective, an MSP, a managed service provider perspective. We use these types of tools to manage thousands of nodes, of endpoints, workstations, servers, etc. Okay? Well, hackers, they're like, hey, why do I go after 50 different customers out there when I can just target MSPs? And now I target one MSP and I have access to hundreds of customers, meaning thousands of devices. So when we think about SolarWinds and to say, hey, they were breached, how did they recover? They had a backup plan. They had a plan of resilience, a recovery plan. But what I'm getting at here is at Stanball Nest, some folks say, well, you know, with pricing, things are expensive, this, that, and I'm like, yeah, but what's the cost of doing business and securing your infrastructure? And I guess that's what gets me. I always put myself in the customer's shoes. Yes, I understand budgets have to come into play, right? But also, you need to validate and understand and accept the risk of if you don't put this control in place. Here's a good example. There's still some folks out there that multi-factor authentication. I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to get around it in the very near future, because if you have any type of even professional liability and or cyber liability insurance, they are telling folks right now, in order for us to renew your policy, you must incorporate multi-factor authentication, otherwise known as MFA or 2FA. You've got to roll that out, and we have to see it validated before we will renew. But there's still some folks out there in the industry like, well, you know, our organization's large. We don't want to impose that type of culture change and yada, yada. And I'm like, you know what? Like, that's not an organization I want to even be part of. Because if there's a breach there, who gets yelled at? IT. And IT teams know this. They're going to resonate as loud as I do. As soon as something doesn't happen, regardless of whether or not it's IT or completely different, if they stop it, their computer doesn't work, the network's down, it's IT that's looked at as the bad guy in a lot of instances. We're trying to change that mindset and say, hey, it's not just IT that needs to have command of this. It's the organization as a whole, from top down, bottom up. End users must understand what it takes to secure your information. And it's not just from a corporate perspective, business perspective. Take the knowledge back to your home. And that's why I tell people too, take this back if you've got kids and family members, grandkids, whatever, nieces, nephews. Think about all the social media platforms out there that are posing a high level of risk. What are you allowing people to do with those platforms? And I could go off on a tangent there, but I'll digress. We'll keep moving on here.
Let me add something real quick to just for a minute. You know, I like the fact that you kind of hammer on multi-factor authentication. For those of you who may not be or following cyber news today, there was a recent article published by Reuters that speaks about Travelers Insurance and an entity filing a claim with them who've been breached. So the important thing to note is that Travelers Insurance is actually pushing back and has taken them to court because of the client's effective misstatement of use of multi-factor authentication. What I mean by that is it's not simply enough to just put it on remote access or VPN. As Phil had mentioned, securing as many accounts as you can, certainly critical server accounts, things like you Windows users, domain controllers. If those are missing, you may have issues in filing claims or getting assistance with your cyber liability insurance carrier.
Absolutely. Good take, Matt. When we think about, again, some more data slides here, the rising cost of data breaches. These are things, and I always tell folks, it's no joke, right? In some organizations, I don't care whether you're $1 million or $1 billion. The larger your organization, a lot of times the larger your amount that you're going to pay, because those hackers, they know what they're going after. So it's all relative to the size of your firm and what percentage of your funds, your revenue is going to go to, potentially, if you do decide to pay it, your ransomware. So the big question here, combating ransomware, do you pay it or don't you pay it? We've had organizations of both mindsets, okay? And I wish I had a silver bullet to sit here and say, yes, you know what, you do this. But really what it comes down to is, number one, making sure you have, and Matt, I mean, we talk about this all the time, it's 3, 2, 1, your 3 backups, your 2 local, your 1 cloud, at a minimum, okay? And that creates your recovery point. Yeah, if you have encryption that goes through and it transfers through your backups, okay, then you may not have a choice. But you have backups, you have 2 local, 1 cloud backup, you've got versioning that's put in place, and you also have encryption features in there depending upon the backup toolset that you're using that'll sniff out and stop malware that may look suspicious, and it'll stop that backup from overwriting the latest backup that's out there. So for organizations we worked with, they've had a breach, and they come to us and said, what do we do? And I'm like, hey, you know what? We validate, we check the backups, and we were able to recover from the latest backup. They might have lost 2 days worth of data, but you know what? They didn't have to pay the ransomware. We wiped the entire server, rebuilt it, recovered from the backup, and they were up and running. There's other organizations are in a different boat. Another organization, they may say, hey, you know what? You got to pay us $2 million to get your data back. And they go through the mindset or the exercise of, okay, how much effort is it going to take us and how long? It may cost more than $2 million in business downtime, productivity, resources, forensic, backups, the recovery, plus they may take 3-4 months just to recover all their data. Friends of ours, she works for a very large, prominent organization, and they had a breach in, it was October of last year. And we went to see them in April of this past year. And she said, we're still recovering. I'm still having to do a lot of manual entries because we don't have our data back. And they paid the ransom. And it was a lot of money. It wasn't just millions. It was a lot of money. So do you pay it? Don't you pay it? Those are things that each organization needs to walk through themselves and diligently map out that process, but that also ties into the incident response plan.
Well, let me jump in quickly if I could. And you guys can see the.
I'll launch the poll a while so people can answer this while you're walking that through.
Sure. And so this ties in nicely. I was just going to mention there are 2 deadly sins that I kind of wanted to get across to this audience with respect to backups. One is connecting your storage to the internet. Mistake number 1. Number 2 is that your backup servers are not on the same production network /LAN as the rest of your data. So it's important to segment that off, but that if you do get those storage repositories easily accessed and or also overwritten.
All right, so the polls, I closed out the poll. Have you gone through a formal process to test your backups to ensure recovery of data? 43% said yes, 21% said no, 36% said not sure. Again, going back to, and maybe thinking this through, maybe rewording this here a little bit better in the future, but have you gone through a formal process to test your backups to ensure recovery data? This is, and I'll speak specifically to manufacturing or those, because I worked in manufacturing before, and man, to get leadership to completely shut down systems to test, not gonna happen. So that's something to think about when you formally walk through the process. So you have your incident response plan, you have your disaster recovery plan, and you literally hand that plan to somebody that's non-technical, maybe a tier 1 in your tech team, and say, look, CIO, director, manager, systems admin, they're all out. Here you go. Like, you've got to stand us up. We are dead in the water. That's what I mean by testing your backups, right? Having somebody walk through that process and get you back up and running. That's all part of what I call your system security plan there as well. Now, Matt, we talk about, you hear folks hear zero trust in the industry, and we have about 10 minutes or so left, but we hear about zero trust. What is zero trust?
Sure, Phil. So one of the first things I'll stress about zero trust is that it is not a product, okay, but it's a strategy. And the general mantra is and always verify. And really what this means is that it's a representation of continuous check and balance system, if you will, to ensure that only our applications are able to access system resources. And so what this is doing is it's removing the legacy belief that once you're permitted access to the perimeter or inside of it, that you're just trusted. And eliminates that aspect of implicit trust. The interesting thing about zero trust is that it can be applied anywhere and everywhere. What I mean by that is through identities, networks, endpoints, applications, data, device even. So one example I like to give is folks on this call are probably familiar with zero trust network access from a VPN substitution perspective. And so what this means is where traditional VPNs offer an example of a castle defended by a moat, often the example that's given. And all I mean by that is network access, you have wide open access to that network, generally speaking. Everyone outside of that barrier is denied access. Everyone on the inside has full access. So when you go about replacing that solution with zero trust, effectively putting a perimeter on the applications, systems you wish to access, and nothing more. So what's happening is organizations are able to benefit quite a bit from zero trust adoption, even if in small increments, because of some of the trends, I would say, in the shifting workforce. And by that, I mean more users are now more than ever remote, as I'm sure many of you are aware. More organizations are adopting cloud infrastructure. Organizations have vastly increased device connectivity. And not for anything, but zero trust can dramatically limit ransomware because users are no longer getting that unlimited access and they're only accessing specific resources. So if and when they are affected by ransomware, that ransomware effectively has nowhere to go. It's constrained. It can't pivot. The last thing I'll mention is that Bill likes to harp on this a lot. I compliment him for it. Data is at the core of zero trust in all aspects and models. And what organizations need to do once they begin to endeavor to begin their zero trust journey, they need to better understand what data they have and process. They need to know where that data is stored. They need to know the classification or sensitivity of that data, who and what should be able to access that data, and then finally under what conditions it should be accessed.
And Matt, to that point, right, it's something that, it's stambleness as well. Least privilege, right? You hear the least privilege, starting out versus, a lot of organizations, they have groups set up in policy within Active Directory, and hey, this person comes in, they get plopped in this security group, which gives them access to X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times those systems don't get reworked. And then you have I would say mass chaos within a lot of these systems here, where somebody coming in and they may fall in, they may be, let's just say, controller or whatever, or CFO, or even in the IT team, and now they have unbridled access to systems they shouldn't have access to. So starting out with zero trust there, right? Giving the least amount of access for these individuals to do their job, perform their roles. Now we have another poll coming up here. Let's see here. Does your organization have a formal and documented incident response plan and or playbook? Incident response plan, you hear about system security plan, SSP, and a lot of these other buzzwords out there, but you have something formally documented that in the event that something does happen, I'll launch this poll, so just launched the poll for y'all, but have something to follow and align with. And in the meantime, Matt, when we think about, we touch base a little on the ransomware, should you pay it, shouldn't you pay it, zero trust, but ultimately, what should that cybersecurity, what I call a cybersecurity stack, right? What does that look like? You know, and Matt, and for folks that, and Matt, maybe you should send this out to everyone after as part of the presentation. But Matt sent me a PDF of all these solutions, these vendors out there that are part of a security stack. And I told him, I sent it back. I said, I just went cross-eyed. I said, it's like thousands and thousands. And for an organization, it's like, where do you start? And it's like Matt and I had told him a few weeks ago, I said, man, I feel like all I've been part of here late is just vendor meetings, vetting out the best security solution. Of course, and okay, we play in the budget as well, the best security solution for the budget that we can roll out, not only to SM, but for our customers. So what does that cybersecurity stack look like, Matt?
Yeah, sure. I will certainly send out that document at the conclusion of the webinar. I'll say briefly, I would certainly implement from a layered perspective for those that may not, firewalls permit traffic to and out of the network. The best firewalls are also able to analyze application layer traffic to help determine protocol. I would also include some of endpoint detection, and these tools are going to provide the necessary protections against malware, your viruses, ransomware, and even the insider threat to a smaller extent. And the important thing to note is it automates the detection and then the actions needed to effectively neutralize that. One other thing it can provide is the ability to construct a forensic timeline and to analyze hidden processes, which aids in prosecution should legal action be sought. Phil mentioned some form of access control. So compromised user credentials ought to be the #1 cause. They're also the #1 target in phishing attacks. So organizations just need to ensure that only their authorized users are allowed to access company accounts. And then one of the most important things you can do to help with that is implement multi-factor authentication. I'll also mention logging and monitoring, which is key. And what this does is it oversees network, endpoint, and application activity. It inspects system events, stores user actions, and then think of logging and monitoring effectively as your network/system overwatch. And it helps to provide near real-time security awareness, either for your own security team or for those managing your team. The last thing I'll mention is just some form of remote access security. And we just touched on this, in that most organizations have VPNs whereby full network level access is granted. Ideally, that should be constrained some. And that's also the impetus to start implementing zero trust, albeit in the baby step process.
All right, Matt, you laid it out there, right? Baby steps. And I think every presentation I do, right, whether it be cybersecurity or infrastructure related and policies or what have you, it's take those bite-sized steps, right? Don't try to eat the whole elephant at one time or you'll never get it down and digest it. You'll end up bagging it and never get done. So we have about 2 minutes here, so I'm going to wrap up with this last poll. Question: does your organization have a formal and documented incident response plan and or playbook? 14% said yes, 53% said no, 33% said not sure. And I'll tell you, you know what? It's not, a lot of organizations don't, okay? It's just something that, you know, you've got to get in play. And the cyber liability, the insurance carriers, they're tightening the reins. And to the point that an individual had asked earlier, right? Any thoughts on how to, on contracting with subcontractors, have good cybersecurity practices in place? How do you vet that out? Here's a question. Do you have an incident response plan? If so, can you share it with us? We want to see that you have a plan of recovery. That's a quick question that you could ask them. Last question here that came up: is there a website you regularly visit for cybersecurity news, information, best practices? I'm part of several. Now, again, these are paid sites. But Matt, I know you're tied into a few of them here. Any recommendations here as we close?
Yes, 100%. For those who aren't, visit www.sans.org. In my estimation, it's worth registering an account with them. There is not one piece of security that they don't cover. And I mean industrial security, application security, network, endpoint, cloud, ransomware, incident response, forensics, you name it, they have it. They also have quite a few resources. And Phil just mentioned, for those of you who do not have an incident response plan, they have guidelines and or templates that are good to use. We also have some of that stuff, so reach out if that's something you need or you want a template or even a checklist.
Excellent. All right, well, hey, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, everybody that joined the call. We are at 3 o'clock. And yes, for the folks at AS, I put it in the chat there. It's www.sans, that's SANS.org. So you can take a look at that, throw that in as a favorite for yourself. All right, so thanks, everybody. Kaylee, you can go ahead and close it out, but I appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully you saw value in it, and we'll be sending over the PowerPoint presentation later. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, this afternoon. We apologize for any audio issues you had on your end. Just a few closing items here. There will be a survey. Let us know how we did. Insert any questions or any comments into that survey, as well as request the CPE certificate there. You will receive a follow-up email with the recording and the handout in an email, so be on the lookout for that. And with that, we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.